Welcome to the Real News Network. I'm Jessica Devereaux in Baltimore. A new investigative report titled Irradiated Iraq, the Nuclear Nightmare We Left Behind, looks at the U.S. legacy of deadly radiation in Iraq. In this expose, writer Barbara Koeppel examines how America's use of uranium missiles and explosives has negatively affected the health of veterans as well as Iraqis, with dramatic increases of cases of leukemia and breast cancer, as well as an increase in infant mortality. Joining us now in our Baltimore studio to talk about her piece is Barbara Koeppel. She's a Washington, D.C. based investigative reporter. Thank you so much for joining us, Barbara.
Thank you for having me.
So, Barbara, first people are going to think nuclear weapons comes to mind when we think of radioactive weapons, not these uranium weapons that you described that are technically conventional weapons. Is that right?
Right, which is how they get away with it, because they're not called nuclear. However, they are radioactive because they contain uranium, and uranium is a radioactive element. They also contain very toxic chemicals. And so, in theory, they're not nuclear, but they are radioactive because of the uranium concentrations, and they have the same effect. They create birth defects, the way you had after Chernobyl. They create all sorts of leukemias, as you said, but huge amounts, not just a little bit, but spikes.
Let's talk about some of those numbers. What did you actually end up finding out?
Well, based on studies that local doctors did, or hospital records, as you know, we invaded Iraq twice, or we had 2 wars with Iraq. The first one was less of an invasion, and it was more bombing and blowing up weapons sites. That was Desert Storm in 1991. And by 1998, the hospital records showed in the city of Basra that you went from something like 40 cases of birth defects to, by 2000, 350, which is enormous. And leukemias also mushroomed, so that you have these dreadful health effects, and some of the veterans' families have some of them too, but they weren't there, living there. They would come in and out for 1 year and still got very sick. But back to 91, so they used what they admitted to. It was that they used weapons that were made, bunker-busting bombs and missiles that were made with depleted uranium. They liked this a lot because you get very high heats and it just blows stuff up immediately. But it leaves behind uranium oxide dust because it incinerates at such a high temperature, it creates microscopic dust particles. It's called uranium oxide dust that float through the air for miles and miles, and then when you breathe them in, they get lodged in your lungs. They don't get eliminated through your body because they're particles, dust particles. And from the lungs, it's an easy trip into the lymph system, the blood system, which carries them to all parts of the body, to all your cells, and then because they are radioactive, it mutates them the same way after we dropped the atomic bomb in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and you had generations of deformed children, and just over and over again. You can't get rid of it. Once a gene or a chromosome is radiated and mutated, it's that way until you stop having children.
I want to get a sense of what the response has been from the United States government as well as the Iraqi government. Let's first start with the U.S. Do they know that this is what is happening to Iraqis?
Well, yes, but they don't want to admit it for all the obvious reasons. The liability would be the most important one. And they don't admit it to the veterans. In fact, on their websites, they say not one known cancer has been caused by the uranium weapons. And they stick to the line that they've only used what's called depleted uranium. In fact, they've used other forms, undepleted and slightly enriched. But if they just say because it's known, and there is international outrage about their use and Britain's use, the coalition of depleted uranium, they say, well, we just used a little of it. And they don't respond to Freedom of Information requests to say how much or where. The Dutch wanted to find out because their troops were exposed, so they told them how much and where, and then a peace group found out and they made that public, but that's just a small portion.
Do you know what that was actually was, the amount of uranium?
Yes, but I can't tell you right now. And it varied from place to place.
Okay.
Because it wasn't one amount everywhere. But they used it because it's the strongest weapon you can have, the strongest missile. And it could fight in 91. There were tank battles in the deserts of Iraq. And they could just blast through the tanks. But of course, that produced the dust that I was talking about, and it would float for miles and miles. But they prized that because you could nothing was as strong that could pierce the armor the way weapons made with uranium. And they did admit to using depleted uranium weapons. They don't admit to the others, by the way.
Gotcha.
But it's used because it's so powerful, more powerful than any other weapon.
All right, so if we have the United States denying using other forms of uranium in their weapons.
Or as much depleted uranium as they actually used.
Exactly, so now then, could we push back on this? Did you find out any information that would actually push back on that thesis?
Well, all the people, the hospital records that some people have accumulated, that they've gone and put together, because the U.S. won't fund, even though researchers have asked for it, they won't fund any research to corroborate this. But people who have gone to the hospitals, as in the city of Basra in Iraq, so they had the number of birth defects a year before 91, which was something like 37. And then by 98, there were 350. And that's from hospital records that have been verified by legitimate researchers. So, if it walks like a duck, it is a duck. And here you've got all these birth defects. And then when we went, but do you want to stick with 91 or do you want to go to when we invaded Iraq in 2003?
Yeah, let's talk about that. 2003,
Okay.
What did we find?
So we now invade Iraq, and the numbers, which had already spiked, took another huge leap. So that by 2008, one interesting number, I hate to just delude you with numbers because it can go, it can get confusing, but there was something like 40 cancers out of 100,000 population. By 2005 or 8, it was up to 1,600 new cancers. And again, a 38% increase in leukemia, a 10% increase in breast cancer. It had an infant mortality rate that was 8 times higher than its neighbor, Kuwait. So you have these numbers. One scientist took samples of the women who had, usually the children die at birth because they're so badly deformed. They have one eye in the center of their head, or their brains are inside out, or their stomachs are inside out, or they have no hands and feet. I mean, they're really grotesque, and they don't tend to live but a few hours or a few days. And the researchers have studied that, and they put together the numbers, but the U.S. doesn't admit to that.
What about the Iraqi government? I'm sure they're being
right. So that's very interesting that you ask that, because they did a study around 2009. Remember, we invaded in 2003, and basically the last of the troops, or most of the troops, were left in 2011. And in 2009, because they were getting so much flack, they did a study that proved that not only did they not have an increase in birth defects and leukemia and general cancers, they had less than developed countries, but they didn't use hospital records. They only did a door-to-door survey and asked people, do you have cancer or something like that. And you have to say, well, why? Why would they? Oh, and then the Lancet, which is a very highly respected British medical journal, wrote an editorial or maybe some people wrote an article saying, we think you need to revisit these numbers. And the WHO also concurred. That's the World Health Organization. So you have to ask yourself, why would the Iraq Ministry of Health and the World Health Organization, which people respect a lot, why would they have concurred? Well, Iraq gets most of its money from the United States. And as long as it depends on the United States for its budget, they're not going to put out information that the United States doesn't want out. And similarly, WHO, all the UN agencies get the biggest part of their budget from the US. Even though it doesn't pay what it's supposed to pay, it still is the largest part of their budget. So it's pretty clear why they take these lines. And the Lancet said, do another study.
Yeah.
This is really crazy. These numbers make no sense.
And then, like you said, they can't actually do real testing because they're not getting funding.
Right.
So you're sort of caught in this catch-22. We have all this evidence that there's smoke, but no one really wants to go investigate if there's a fire.
Right.
And you're saying that we certainly need to be questioning this more. And
their websites keep putting out the lie that there's not one cancer, or that there were also burn pits. And for those who don't know what a burn pit is, when the US invaded and they've got thousands and thousands of service people there, they have to put them somewhere. So they have bases. Some can be as small as 20 men or women, and some can have 90,000. And how do you dispose of your waste? You have to dig a big hole in the ground, and they're called burn pits. And they dump everything, whether it's human waste, plastic bottles, which when they're burned, that's illegal, by the way, according to US regulations, but they burned them anyway. And that produces dioxin, which is the main ingredient in Agent Orange. And they burn these round the clock. They put in unexploded weapons, hospital waste, batteries, lithium batteries, everything, which is incredibly toxic. And so our troops, who were stationed usually for a year, a term would be, they were breathing this, and some of them got and are terribly sick right now. But the Iraqis, who were breathing them for years and years and years, not 1 year terms, are even sicker. And the wife of a captain who breathed in the smoke from the burn pits started an organization called 360.org. I'm confessing, there might be another word in there, but to get support for these veterans.
I was going to say that. Is there anything on the side of the Iraqis? Is there any sort of legal remedies for them?
Zero.
Nothing is going on to...
No, zero. And even for the Americans, some of the veterans have launched a suit, but I don't know how, this is probably going to take 10 years through the courts, but even there the US didn't want to admit it, because when this woman's husband, Captain Torres, came back and couldn't breathe, the VA diagnosed him with some unknown problem. And then more and more of other soldiers and Marines had the same problem. So the DoD sent 200 of them to Vanderbilt University Medical School. And the head of the pulmonary division biopsied them, which the VA didn't do. They just x-rayed them. And I spoke with the head of it, a Dr. Miller, who said, we biopsied them and we saw this very debilitating lung disease, which is only going to get worse and worse. And he stopped getting veterans. The DoD, the Defense Department and the VA stopped sending him veterans to study because they were very unhappy that he had biopsied them, because he said you can't see it unless you biopsy their lungs. And so there are all these people terribly sick, but the DoD, the Defense Department, the VA doesn't want to admit it. And
why don't they want to admit it? It
well,
comes
liability.
Yeah.
If you admitted that you exposed 200,000 troops to this, you can imagine what the liability would be.
And what would the liability be for places like Raytheon or Lockheed Martin?
I don't know. It's a good question.
Defense
because they're the ones. Raytheon has a patent for uranium, for weapons where uranium is an option. And that patent's been around for maybe 15 years. and one other corporation too, but they don't say that they're in these weapons. They just say, no, no, they're conventional, but in fact, they are radioactive.
Okay.
And have the same effects that you have from Chernobyl when the reactors blew, or that you have from Hiroshima. I mean, you just keep getting generation after generation of mutated genes and mutated children and adults. But the dust maybe has settled, so there's perhaps not as much dust now, but for the people that were living there in the 2000s, it's in their lungs, it's in their bodies.
Yeah,
it's not going to go away.
And for generations, as
yeah,
you said.
It doesn't wear out, ever.
Yeah.
Never. Once a gene is mutated, it's mutated.
Barbara, really, really fascinating investigative report. Thank you so much for joining us in studio.
Thank you very much for having me.
And thank you for joining us on the Real News Network.